What's up, YouTube? All right, so this is part two of Mourning, Modernism, and Postmodernism by Tammy Clewell. Um, all right, so let's just get into it. The section is called Mourning Art into the Lighthouse, and this section really does talk about To the Lighthouse. Even though it's kind of like relatively at the end, it still does a good job at relating the material to the novel that we're actually reading in my class. All right, so a lot is happening in this section. This is definitely the section um, to really delve into. The first part did do a good job of kind of setting us up for this. Uh, so, first sentence: Woolf wrote to the lighthouse, as she claimed, to come to terms with the lingering difficulties posed by the death of her mother. Um, and then we see a lot of that in Woolf work, well, at least To the Lighthouse, from what I read, that she does this kind of a autobiographical, um, autobiographical kind of work for herself. Uh, she establishes the parameters. No, I'm sorry. So her father wrote the Mausoleum book, which is an elegiac narrative that establishes the parameters of a Victorian performance of grief engendering of the 19th century loss. So in this kind of section, she really is pushing back against her father's idea of grief. That that in the Mausoleum book, it really refers to women as a source, as the kind of source of grief. Uh, that's not exactly true. The source, women can convey grief more effectively and kind of, I guess, productively more than men, um, and that's what a lot of Woolf fights back at. Um, Woolf did not simply reject her father's idealization of Julia, who is her or Stephen's wife that has passed, as an instance of patriarchal ideology, an endorsement of the ideals of female marital virtue and maternal self-sacrifice that precluded roles for women outside the sphere of the domestic, including Woolf's own aspirations as a writer. Um, a lot of this is like massive quotes, so I won't just like read all of the massive quotes. Um, but right now we're really talking about Stephen as a clear starting point into this idea of um, women being able to convey emotion and grief more than men. And that's so kind of a quote right here on grief. Grief frequently gives rise to a sense of regret on the mourner's part, regret for both unfulfilled aspiration and misdeeds. Okay, so echoing Freud's claim that mourners often reproach themselves for causing the death of a loved one, Stephen accuses himself for his wife's passing, believing the excessive demands he placed on Julia taxed her emotional strength and produced a weakness of heart. Right. So at this point, we're kind of seeing what Stephen really believes about mourning, and I think we're supposed to kind of project it as a patriarchal or uh, improper interpretation of proper mourning. Um, he continues to talk about how he was kind of putting all of his emotions on her, kind of drove her to the grave, kind of an idea. Um, the Mausoleum book demonstrates the extent to which Stephen subscribes to the 19th century gendering of grief. Um, females were viewed as females were viewed as emotional rather than intellectual beings. So for kind of this instance, for sure, there's patriarchal kind of connotations to it. An economy, Stephen's perception, therefore, reflects, therefore, an economy of bereaved sympathy that reinforces female subservience in the patriarchal household. So the social norms of mourning permit him to assign a double burden of loss to a woman, compelling his stepdaughter to embody the grief she may have experienced after her mother's passing, as well as alleviate his own. Um, there are a lot of good quotes to kind of reinforce, but like I've been saying, the idea is that he has made a choice to put all of this kind of grieving onto women in his life, and he does blame himself, but it's kind of like a self-pitying. He wants other people to kind of confirm his ideology, which in the book To The Lighthouse, Mr. Ramsay is this character. I mean, the Woolf comes out and says, when we get into the mind of Mr. Ramsay, that he wants Mrs. Ramsay to kind of confirm his thoughts, his feelings. And I think that this is definitely the kind of correlation we're supposed to take from To The Lighthouse and to Woolf's father. So we're kind of going into that idea. I can't pronounce this guy's name. Shersari argues have male writers from Petrarch to Lacan, Cesare argues, have been able to reclaim personal loss as social gain, the gain that derives from the public acknowledgement of the writer's own sensitive and inspired genius. So we're really, so as Stephen writes this, he's acknowledging that he's going to leave this behind. He's acknowledging that these ideas are going to be his legacy in a way that promotes him, I would say, as kind of an intellectual, as kind of a reaffirming Victorian values of where he would be praised as kind of keeping the canonical ideas alive. But as we said, and as this essay says, Woolf pushes back against that drastically. And I think in the right kind of way. And he does idolize her. He creates this kind of idea. He rather would create this idea of Julia rather than kind of describe her as a regular person. Woolf criticizes her father's writing as wholly self-serving. Woolf understood a fundamental function of the elegy, the transmission of the dead person's legacy to the living. Stephen's representation of Julia as a marital and maternal ideal created an encumbering inheritance for the Stephen daughters. Also, Woolf criticizes her mother. Woolf overly criticizes her mother for believing that all men required an infinity of care and making a fetish out of Stephen's well-being. So she's really going against both of her parents. I mean, she's really just pushing back this idea of Victorian values of family structure, kind of, I don't want to say regurgitating, but kind of, I would say eating itself from the inside of, there's kind of, it creates kind of negative ideas towards what a productive family life is. And it also destroys kind of men and women as individuals. And then there's this idea, though a big part of this is the idea of the pathetic fallacy, which is defined as an integral component of the genre's compensatory machinery. The pathetic fallacy personifies a natural world that mourns along with the bereaved, right? So we're really getting into this idea of nature kind of is grieving with the individual. And I think it is kind of confusing at first, and well, confusing in general, but In To The Lighthouse, I think she does a really good part or job at portraying time pass. I mean, the middle of the novel is called Time Passes, so we really get to see the kind of decay that the environment goes through, along with the group of individuals that are at the lighthouse or around the lighthouse at the Ramsey summer home. Let's see. The pathetic fallacy assumes a deep affinity between the human and the natural. It consoles by promising the rebirth of the dead uh, in a natural landscape governed by a cycle of growth, maturation, decline, and regeneration. Woolf was certainly not alone in her suspicious attitude toward the consoling power of the trope, right? So this is a trope. I mean, it's a regular kind of idea. She is challenging it, as we're saying. And it goes a heightened critique in the commemorative lyrics of the Great War. Soldier poets, kind of this idea of the nationalism, unneeded nationalism, or lies that a country tells an individual to kind of promote their own national identity, or simply get people to fight. The possibility. This is Clewell. Clewell is examining a Isaac Rosenberg poem called "Dead Man's Dump," saying the possibility of the unburied body of a soldier disrupts the consoling idea of a natural order where regeneration trumps decay, a point Rosenberg's poem makes to force the reader into a confrontation with the brutal realities of the Great War. Yeah, I guess I haven't really focused on the Great War so much as a driving factor, but this is in a section called Woolf and the Great War, which obviously had massive influences on Woolf and her writings. Woolf's writing goes so far as to identify the projection of grief onto the landscape with the violence found on the battlefields of Europe, and that kind of goes with the decay of the lighthouse, coming back after 10 years and seeing what has drastically changed. The characters that are initially at the summer home, some of them die, some of them, specifically one because of the Great War, Andrew Ramsey. Prue, I believe, dies in childbirth, and Mrs. Ramsey just kind of passes, and it fills this hole. So we have created a sense of grief in this novel, simply because the time factor and the war kind of influence. So the first part of the novel, it's split up into three parts. The first part of the novel is I think 7 or 12 hours. I can't really remember, but it's like 100 something pages. And then Time Passes is just like it says. I think it's only like 10 pages. And then maybe it's not 10 pages. Maybe I'm getting that confused with the time that it's associated with. But a lot of time passes, and we see before, middle, and after. Woolf's narrator moves on to produce an insightful account of how the painful extremity of loss gives the pathetic fallacy a powerful and nearly irresistible allure. So it's something to relate to the environment more than it's kind of like this quote says: "The search for meaning and solace yields next to nothing." But we really want to examine how individuals deal with grief, with religion, the environment, internally, externally, especially with a novel. You have to describe kind of things like that. The trope buffers the anguish of loss. That's interesting. It permits the consoling idea that nature participates in human grief and places the dead within an endless cycle of rebirth, promised by the inevitable coming of spring. So, like, as seasons change, rebirth, death. there are a lot of different quotes about kind of relating nature to grieving, and how kind of pointless it is, really, on how to see an individual in time, or not in time, but in nature, like the nature that it somehow is reacting to human life, which I think it is kind of similar to like the god. She's really just dismantling everything. It's kind of a deconstruction, kind of mentality, but it's really not exactly deconstruction. So we'll talk about the most important part, time passes, which is the middle part. Time passes undoubtedly reflects Woolf's feminist perspective. However, the section also engages what James Hall has addressed as Woolf's specifically artistic response to the legacy of the war. Woolf eliminated numerous identifications between the war and masculine aggression. So I guess it is kind of more of a deconstruction idea, seeing as how she really wants to dismantle typical masculine and women roles. And she does that in Jacob's Room, from what I've read. And in this, I have not touched Jacob's Room. But in Hall's provocative thesis, Woolf opted against a direct account of the war's patriarchal source, quote, not because it was unpopular or because she lacked courage, but because it's not the history she wanted to write. And however appealing, it was not art. And we do go into kind of like, what is art? What makes art? Woolf's dismantling of the pathetic fallacy strikes me with some force, evidences her fundamental interest in redefining the resources of elegiac writing in light of the war years. If the abiding question raised into the lighthouse concerns the kind of mourning practices possible after the Great War, Woolf's response could not be more directly demonstrated. Art must be stripped of consoling social paradigms and redemptive literary tropes in order to confront the politics of manufactured death soberly. So we're really getting into what is art. I guess at this point it would be good to introduce Lily Briscoe, who really is the main character of the novel. She, throughout the entire time, she is constructing a painting, and she doesn't finish it until right at the end. And then later it kind of talks about what that is. Woolf strips the pathetic fallacy of all consolatory effects, insisting that when art neutralizes the anguish of loss, it obscures the very conditions that produce destructive violence. So, I'll read that again. When art neutralizes the anguish of loss, it obscures the very conditions that produce destructive violence. So, kind of seeing art, it's difficult for Lily Briscoe to create this art. What is it? What is it creating? Is it supposed to make you feel better? I mean, is it supposed to solve the problems of mourning? Is it supposed to not solve them? I mean, what is this painting supposed to do, if it's supposed to do anything? And I think Woolf is saying, when you can define a certain mourning kind of mentality through art, it diminishes the actual kind of situation that it's supposed to define. That you can now somehow understand what happened rather than actually experience it. Having resisted the lure of the pathetic fallacy in time passes, the novel's third section demonstrates how our artist Lily Briscoe retreats inward and discovers the contents of a bereaved consciousness, the need to resist her own attractions to art's consolatory power. In attempting to complete her painting, a post-impressionist rendering of Mrs. Ramsay and her son James, begun a decade earlier, Lily considers she has not experienced the great revelation. She has failed to resolve the aesthetic dilemma that brought her painting to a standstill. However, the wartime violence that claimed Andrew's life, along with the premature deaths of Mrs. Ramsay and Prue, have made Lily acutely aware that any present solution depends on distancing herself from the compensatory imagination of both conventional mourning and commemorative art. I think that kind of really just proves what I said, that it's Woolf is trying to resist this idea of negotiating mourning with a creation of art. Yeah. The probably the most prominent text that Clewell references is Virginia Woolf and Postmodernism by Pamela Caughey. And this really gets into Virginia Woolf and postmodernism, because it's weird that it kind of hits on the last 4 pages, but so I'll just say what she says. Caughey does not categorize Woolf as a postmodernist, for she resists generalizing from reading Woolf's work in terms of postmodernism to concluding that she is postmodernist. Rather, Caughey uses postmodernism concepts to challenge the adequacy of modernist paradigms to explain Woolf's writings. So she's not even saying he's postmodernist, which he's not. But there are obviously lenses that you can look through for Woolf through postmodernism. Woolf's artists not only draw attention to the failure of their own artistic creations, they also reject, in Caughey's analysis, an array of modernist positions, particularly the assumptions that the artist is a special and self-sufficient individual, that the artwork is original and autonomous, and that art is a means of providing order or revealing truth. Right. exactly what we've been talking about, that it can't portray exactly what it's supposed to portray. Clewell says that Caughey's refusal to choose any classification for Woolf's work strikes me as limited in her study. Rather than claim that modernist conceptions of language and narrative cannot account for Woolf's writing, I read To the Lighthouse as a means of articulating Woolf's own formulation of modernist aesthetics, a writing strategy characterized by the rejection of formal unity and the refusal to allow art to console in a world that has been fragmented by personal and social loss. Okay, this is a good quote. Quote, in production of the novel, and by interrupting both with the rupturing effects of the Great War. Woolf grounds a practice of anti-consolatory mourning on the very failure of her artist to derive recompense from the work of art. She goes on to examine Mr. Carmichael, at least as far as Lily summarizes, endorses a theory of the aesthetic where the dead live on in the timeless memorials of elegiac art. I really need to figure out how to say that word. Literature, as he sees it, steps in and fills the vacated space of the sacred and of ritual mourning in the post-war years, replacing outworn social ceremonies with the aesthetic ceremonies of elegiac art. Woolf both raises and evaluates this compensatory aesthetic, giving the lie to the assumption that art transcends the determinants of history and politics. I feel like I'm kind of winding down. So I will... just go to the final paragraph. So this is kind of just everything that I think Clewell really wanted to get out there. In her fiction on Mourning, Woolf dramatizes the endurance of grief to demonstrate that emotional bonds to the lost other have not been severed, that wounds have not healed. In similar fashion, her novels refuse to fully digest and be done with the past, only by preserving the intractable otherness of the lost other and the historical past. Only by adapting art to an articulation of what Woolf called invisible presences can the possibility for an anti-consolatory mourning practice be fully realized. Woolf's resistance to healing is important to our understanding of her modernist mourning project, for she asks us to live grief in such a way, to borrow Kathleen Woodward's suggestive formulation, that one is still in mourning, but no longer exclusively devoted to mourning. With the final brushstroke down the center of her canvas, Woolf's artist shows us why we need to perpetually remake our grief and perpetually remake our mourning art. Woolf teaches us, finally, that refusing consolation and sustaining grief makes loss available for new interpretations of gender and new identifications with feminist aims. Okay, so the resistance to healing is probably the most interesting aspect of mourning that I could get out of this. There is no way to finally get rid of mourning. That there is no way to. You can only get used to it. You can't get rid of it. And I think that's what she really kind of criticizes art for. I think she criticizes religion on that kind of basis, that we can't get rid of these things simply because we want to. We have to acknowledge that the mourning is still there, but we can't get rid of it. Yeah, like I said, I think I'm winding down. I think I did kind of describe the things in this relatively in depth. I will make another one. The next one is Licia Rosenthal's Mourning, Modernism, Literature, Catastrophe, and the Politics of Consolation. So I'll definitely make a video on that. All right, guys. I hope this has been all right. I hope it's not been too boring, especially the second one. Like I said, I'm winding down, but all right, I'll definitely see you guys next time.